Good afternoon. It's a privilege to be invited to speak before Professor Mint's class, and I'm especially happy to introduce the captivity narrative to you today, because I believe that the literary genre of the captivity narrative gives rise to issues that are at the center of the colonial experience in North America. Today I'll undertake a study of two decidedly different captivity narratives: the New English account, that was authored by Mary Rowlandson and has the unwieldy title of The Sovereignty and Goodness of God, together with the faithfulness of His promises displayed, being a narrative of the captivity and restoration of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson. And I'll look at that account side by side the new French captivity narrative by Pierre Miu, a brief narrative that he entitles Relation de sa captivité parmi les Inuits, the account of his captivity among the Inuits, a tribe of northeastern Quebec that's loosely associated with the Cree. But first, let me outline my goals for this period. I'm primarily interested in discussing the text, in having a conversation about the captivity narratives that are particularly interesting to me because they represent the voice of the private individual in colonial society. They're not the distanced, measured, official statements by a public personage in an official capacity, although they are written for a specific community and they have political designs of their own. But nonetheless, they're individual statements of individual experience. At the same time, I'd like to use these texts to explore the disparate uses of the captivity narrative within colonial cultures. That is, I want to look at the conventions of this literary genre and the purpose for which these accounts were written. And finally, I'll argue that the captivity narrative as a literary form is not restricted to 17th and 18th century literature. It's not a literary dinosaur that had a short-lived life, but it's an enduring literary topos that continues well into the more modern literatures of Canada and the US. So let me begin by putting forth a definition of the New English captivity narrative. When we approach the text of a novel or a play, for example, we have some notion of the nature of that literary genre. We know the shape, we know their conventions. We understand the basic form of a three-act play, for example. At the very least, we know to expect a protagonist. We know that there will be an element of conflict in the second act, and we know to expect some measure of resolution in the third act. And how is this useful? Well, it helps us to recognize the requirements and goals of this literary genre, and ultimately to decode the text. The New English captivity narrative is an important literary genre, and as we might expect, it has generic requirements of its own. In fact, the generic requirements of the captivity narrative are so highly codified that they were considered the formula fiction of the 17th century. Let me outline four elements of the formula. First, the New English captivity narrative presents its audience with a didactic statement, which is to say that its central objective is instruction. Many of these tales appeared first as embedded narratives in Puritan sermons and were intended to remind the congregation of its relationship with their deity and the attending responsibilities of that relationship. In the aftermath of an Indian raid, a congregation would ask itself, why did God send us this plague? How have we failed our God? How can we ensure greater piety within our ranks and ensure somehow that this ill does not befall us again? And these tales, the captivity narratives, attempt to address the community's concern and lead them to spiritual vigilance. A second, but closely related element of the captivity narrative is its account of the individual piety of the author. It's a form of conversion narrative for the author. The man or woman who was fortunate to survive captivity understood the survival as a sign of God's favor. Consequently, the captivity narrative frames an author's life in 3 stages. It accounts for his or her character, the failings, the flaws, the foibles in advance of captivity. It details the period of captivity, which can be understood as God's opportunity to punish or correct the wayward child. And finally, in the statement following the release from captivity, the author takes stock of his experience and recognizes that he or she is truly chosen by God for eternal salvation. The captivity narrative also afforded the New Englanders an intimate, first-hand account of life among the native peoples about which they had very little authoritative information. The colonists were both terrified by and curious about these peoples, and captivity narratives offered them a voyeuristic introduction to their enemy. And finally, and I think this is equally important, the captivity narratives fulfilled the New Englanders' need for story. Every culture needs a fiction, a literature, needs story. And these were a people that had absolutely no secular literature whatsoever. And so these wonderful, suspenseful narratives served to entertain them, as well as to bind them together as a community. Without question, Mrs. Rowlandson's text satisfies all of the criteria of a bona fide captivity narrative. She clearly understands her release from the Indians as a sign of God's favor. During captivity, she confesses that she did not always keep the Sabbath, that she found too much pleasure in tobacco, and nonetheless, she wants us to know that she stands as Job. She stands as Lot's wife, and she appears to herself as Moses wandering in the Negev desert, those biblical figures whom she repeatedly quotes throughout the text. And she finds consolation that her suffering is analogous to the suffering of these religious peoples since the beginning of biblical history. And when she quotes Job to state, "And I only am escaped to tell the news," she is signaling to her audience that she is returned as one of God's elect to speak to them of her spiritual ills and of their spiritual ills, her opportunity for reformation and their collective opportunity for reformation. Like many of the survivors of captivity narratives, Mary Rowlandson uses the word redeemed to describe her release from the native tribe. Of course, this word denotes her return. But we can't ignore the spiritual connotation. Her return is a sign of her redemption, that is, her salvation, in time and in eternity. Mary Rowlandson also uses her narrative to educate her community about the ways of the Native Americans. She details the travel patterns of these people. She talks about their foodstuffs, the way in which they bury their dead, and she speaks to their social order. Her opening lesson is that they are barbarous creatures whose life prefigures the horrors of hell. And you perhaps remember the dance scene that was so horrifying to her. And in the final remove, at the other end of the text, she concludes that God strengthened them only to be a scourge to your people. And that is, the sole purpose of the natives was to serve as an example of evil for the Puritan community in order to validate their own conception of what constituted good life, holy life. But while I'm interested in detailing the ways in which Rowlandson's narrative fits the classic pattern of the captivity narrative, I'm actually more interested in discussing those elements in the text that defy this definition, that put a little pressure on this definition. And we'll speak more generally about literary genre. We take a certain satisfaction in being able to fit a given literary piece into a larger corpus of literature, to identify it within the tradition of the novel or the short story. But at the same time, there's no such thing as the model of the short story, the ideal short story. And a short story very often generates interest in the ways in which it backs off. It departs from the classic generic requirements of the model short story. So I'd like to look at the ways in which Mary Rowlandson, wittingly or unwittingly, puts pressure on the definition of the captivity narrative. Because there's much in her account that calls into question the didactic statements that she issues in the first and second removes, and then in the 20th removes at the other end of the text. And for example, as I said, opening and at the close of her text. Yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt. Your question then that you wish to answer in your speaking is how she challenges the captivity narrative as a form, as a literary form?
No, how the narrative shows signs of tension relative to the classic configuration of the captivity narrative. Ways in which she departs from the party line, the statement that she purports to make at the outset. If you recall from your reading, in the opening of the text, she quotes Job, "I alone am escaped to tell the news, and I'm here to tell you that these people are, in fact, the personifications of Satan in the New World. These people are the devil." And at the close of the narrative, she says exactly the same thing. But I'm interested in what happens in the body of the narrative. And I'm suggesting that what happens in that body really stands in defiance of her initial presentation of herself and her experience, and it stands in defiance at her closing presentation of herself. But at the center of the text, we see a woman who gradually comes to recognize her captors as people, and more importantly, as individuals. There are cruel men and women among them, but there are also those who exhibit kindness in offering her a Bible, a slice of bear meat, a handful of corn, 6 ground nuts. And in the 10th remove, she acknowledges as much. She says, "Sometimes I met with favor, and sometimes nothing but frowns." And this, it's not much of an acknowledgement, but it's a radical departure from her original depiction of these people as hellhounds. She's grateful for her master's protection. She wants to please him. She cooks a meal for him and his wife. She washes her face. She grooms her hair at his bidding. And in these scenes, she appears to us for all the world as a Native American woman taking part in the tribe. She learns to recognize diversity among these people, and the distinctions between them are blurred. The distinctions between her and them are blurred. She's able to see herself as one of them, and she's able to see them as one of her. We see real evidence of Mary Rowlandson's acculturation in her discussions of foodstuffs within the narrative. In her Puritan community, this good wife spent a great deal of time and energy harvesting foodstuffs, preparing foodstuffs, preserving food, serving food, cleaning up after food, and turning around and doing the same thing all over again. So we should not be surprised that she focuses on food in her narrative. a large feature of her life. She's also weak and literally starving. So again, we can't be surprised that the motif of foodstuffs reappears with such frequency throughout the narrative. However, if we pull out the incidents of her discussion of foodstuffs from the narrative, we witness this woman's gradual adaptation to the culture of the tribe that is her captor. And this, in turn, signals her adaptation to tribal life. Rowlandson recognizes as much in the fifth remove, when she says, "The first week of my being among them, I hardly ate anything. The second week I found my stomach grew very faint for want of something, and yet it was very hard to get down their filthy trash. But the third week, though I could think how formerly my stomach would turn against this or that, and I could starve and die before I could eat such things, yet they were sweet and savory to my taste." She herself is describing her development in this passage. In the seventh remove, 2 removes later, Rowlandson becomes even more adventuresome, and we can read adaptive here in trying native foods, when she asks a man for a piece of horse liver. "What?" says he. "Can you eat horse liver?" I told him I would try if he would give me a piece, which he did, and I laid it on the coals to roast. But before it was half ready, they got half of it away from me, so that I was fain to take the rest and eat it as it was, with the blood about my mouth, and yet a savory bit it was to me." I think we learn a lot about this woman in this passage, and we learn a lot about what she's learning. First, naturally, she needs to satisfy her hunger, but she never forgets to frame this activity with biblical passage, to put it in the context of her spirituality. "For the hungry soul, every bitter thing is sweet," she says. Second, she's learning quickly. Not only is she eating raw foods that she would consider trash earlier, but she's in fact eating them raw. She learns that if you leave the meat on the coals for any length of time and you try to have it well done, as is the British manner, you'll never get your teeth on it. Somebody will take it away from you. So our picture of this good Puritan good wife at the close of the seventh remove is of a woman licking horse liver blood from her lips, from her cheeks, and from her fingers. This is a changed woman. Furthermore, we see later how Mary Rowlandson puts this lesson to use, and in a shocking fashion. In the 18th remove, she and her captives come upon some English children captured by another tribe. And Rowlandson is able to identify one of the children as her own niece, her sister's daughter. She has a visit with her sister's daughter and then is attracted by the announcement of some food elsewhere. She breaks her account to speak of her hunger, and she writes, "I went to another wigwam where there were 2 of the English children. The squaw was boiling horse's feet. Then she cut me off a little piece and gave one of the English children a piece also. Being very hungry, I had quickly eaten up mine, but the child could not bite it. It was so tough and sinewy, but lay sucking, gnawing, chewing, and slabbering of it in the mouth and hand. Then I took it of the child, ate it myself, and savory it was to my taste. Then I may say as Job, chapter 6, verse 7, the things that my soul refused to touch, as are my sorrowful meat. Thus the Lord made that pleasant and refreshing, which another time would have been an abomination." Now this is truly a changed woman. And in this passage, we learn to what extent Mary Rowlandson has relinquished her Puritan identity. Not only does she eat food that an English woman would consider inedible, a piece of horsefoot that someone gnawed and spit on, but she also engages in a practice that she recently learned, taking food from someone who cannot control it themselves. And in this instance, she does the unthinkable. She takes food from a child, and not the generic child, but an English child, a child from her own community. Now, this behavior from an English woman, a pious woman, a mother. Furthermore, she immediately attempts to ennoble her action by framing it with scriptural reference. Thus I may say, as Job chapter 6, verse 7, the things that my soul refused to touch, as are my sorrowful meat. As if the scriptural reference somehow blesses the thievery. So when I speak of tension in this narrative, tension between the generic conventions and its defiance of these conventions, these are precisely the passages that I'm considering. One goal of Rowlandson's account, as we noted, is to portray herself as one of God's elect, Calvinist woman who never wavered in her commitment to her religious faith during her entire period of captivity, never wavered from ethical behavior and generosity within her community. And although she persists in pushing this rhetorical agenda within her narrative, the account itself contradicts the framework. Let's look at another way of approaching the complex issue of self-identity and identification of the enemy within Rowlandson's narrative. This time is revealed in her use of pronouns. Let's look at it exclusively from a grammatical point of view. Now, at the outset of her account, Mary Rowlandson would insist that there is no complexity there. We know who is the Christian, and we know who are the black creatures in the night. However, within the body of the text, Rowlandson's very use of pronouns becomes problematic, and it issues the kinds of complexities that she disavows at the beginning and then at the close, especially in the middle of her captivity. The we of which she claims to be a part is no longer the we of which she had claimed to be a part. Let's look at the seventh remove for an interesting example of the grammatical tension. That I'm referring to. She opens the remove by relating, after a restless and hungry night there, we had a wearisome time of it the next day. And it's absolutely clear here that the we that she's referring to are herself and her captors. But the subsequent sentences reveal her confusion with her sense of communal identity. As we went along, I saw a place where English cattle had been. That was a comfort to me, such as it was. Quickly after that, we came to an English path, which so took with me that I thought I could have freely lied down and died. Now, although Rowlandson is here describing a landscape that she finds familiar, it resembles home, she nonetheless describes in a distanced manner where English cattle had been, an English path. And never once does she say where our cattle had been, or a path like ours. Later in the day, when she's feeling more at home in the English landscape, she says, that day, a little after noon, we came to Squawkeek, where the Indians quickly spread themselves over the deserted English fields, gleaning what they could find. Some picked up ears of wheat that were crickled down, some found ears of Indian corn, some found ground nuts. I I myself got 2 ears of Indian corn. What happened to the we? She's engaging in the same activity as the Indians, but she's making it very clear to her reader that she's separating herself from them. She's linguistically and logically distancing herself from them. The Indians, they, as opposed to I. And at the end of this same remove, a solemn sight methought it was, to see fields of wheat and Indian corn forsaken and spoiled, and the remainders of them to be food for our merciless enemies. That night we had a mess of wheat for our supper. Now, who are our merciless enemies? In this passage, she's fully identifying with the English. And our merciless enemies are the natives. Now, we have to note the irony of her understanding here that a field that appears English but is on Indian soil and grows Indian corn is somehow, in her view, forsaken when Indians harvest that corn. But nonetheless, to return to our main discussion, the final sentence reads, that night we had a mess of wheat for our supper. Eating again within the tribal community. She's returned to them linguistically. She is one of their we, and their supper is her supper. At this point in the narrative, Mary Rowlandson has taken on an economic role in the tribe, a social role in the tribe. She understands the hierarchy of these peoples and her place within the hierarchy. And she appears to us as an Indian woman. Her language in the remove reveals a similar tale. Mary Rowlandson's captivity narrative was first published, so to speak. I should say, was first made public when it was delivered from her husband's pulpit in South Church in Boston. It was meant to be a clear-cut tale of a devout Puritan woman who remained a devout Puritan woman throughout captivity and returned a devout Puritan woman at the end of the narrative. No surprises, no development, all reassurance. But this is clearly not the case. A close reading of the account reveals a woman who's not static during captivity. She alters her sense of identity and that of her enemy during that experience. And at the close of the narrative, she's still coming to terms with that experience, an experience she doesn't fully understand. In her summation statement in the 20th remove, Mary Rowlandson doesn't acknowledge those kindnesses of the Native Americans toward her. She doesn't acknowledge the acculturation into the Indian tribe. But she can't dispute the accounts of kindness that appear earlier. And she can't renege on the acculturation that she experienced. Her words challenge her words. And I'm moved by one of her final thoughts. I remember the time when I used to sleep quietly without workings in my thoughts, whole nights together. But now it is other ways with me. In captivity, Mary Rowlandson learned more than she can reveal in overt statement to her audience. She's struggling with acculturation that she did not desire and that she cannot fully understand and she can't fully accept. But there it is, in her text and in her life. She's forever changed. Or in her words, now it is other ways with me. I'd like to look very briefly at the account of the Jesuit priest, Pierre Miu, and just set that side by side, the captivity account of Mary Rowlandson. It's more abbreviated than that of Rowlandson. It's also less complex. He's not a subtle thinker, and he's certainly not a prose stylist. However, my main point is that we simply do not see the same tension in his narrative that we see so clearly in the account of Mary Rowlandson. And this is true largely because there's little occasion to produce such ruptures in the text. Miu knows his captors. He knows them intimately. Like many of the Jesuits who came to New France, Miu left his native France expressly to work among these peoples. He prepared for this academically. He studied native languages in the Jesuit universities in Brittany and Normandy. He learned about the culture of these peoples from the missionaries who preceded him in New France. So when Miu was captured, he wasn't among unknown, terrifying peoples. He wasn't among the enemy. He was among his congregation. Or to use a metaphor common to the priests of New France, he was as a shepherd with his flock. Or in his words, actually, je ne venais pas comme captif. I didn't come as a captive, but as a missionary who returned to visit my flock. And Miu truly felt that he had little to fear from these peoples, the Inuits. He expresses much greater anxiety and confusion in confronting the larger Iroquois nation and in attempting to understand their ambiguous relationship with the English, whom we come to recognize as his true enemy. However, among the Inuit, he's literally at home. Miu says they prepared my mat for me, and if they had something good to eat, they gave me first choice of the food. He knows the pecking order of these peoples. He knows the families whom he encounters. He baptized them. He baptized their children. He is their metaphorical father. And throughout the account, we may witness ill treatment by malicious individuals, but Miu understands these events as such. They're the evil wrought by singular peoples, just as we experience in one's own society. And as for tension in the narrative, the likes of which we experience when we read Rowlandson's account, I can speak to just one. Despite Miu's testimony to the generosity, the morality, the spirituality of the Inuit people, he persists in describing these people as ces pauvres sauvages chrétiens, these poor Christian savages. It would appear that Miu's deprecation and diminution of these people stands in contrast to his persistent description of them as Christian, as his people. And the words Christian and savage should, for him, contradict each other. But under great pressure, in extreme situation, Pierre Miu inadvertently reveals that in his estimation, the Inuit remain uncivilized as compared to the French, irrespective of the salvation offered by Catholic baptism. And in terms of his audience and their reception of his experience, we have to take into account the fact that this narrative is actually a letter addressed to his colleagues, other Jesuit missionaries in New France. They would understand that the issue of captivity for him is in fact no issue whatsoever. The Jesuits saw their mission in New France in terms of captivity. They denied themselves life in France. And being Jesuits, they denied themselves an intellectual life, an academic life in France. And they set themselves in alien circumstances to live among these peoples. They knew that they might be killed by these peoples or by tribes surrounding these peoples. And while that was not a fate to be desired, it was nonetheless a reality of their mission, and it was an honorable fate, the opportunity for martyrdom. So Miu's prime motive in his narrative was to assure his colleagues of his continuous ministry to the Inuit people, to assure his colleagues of their acceptance of his ministry, and to assure them of his willingness to die. Finally, I'd like to address one point regarding the captivity narrative as a literary genre and the enduring importance of that genre and its motifs throughout the literature of North America, throughout the history of the literature of North America. And what I mean to emphasize here is that the topos of captivity is not exclusive to 17th and 18th century literature, but it appears and reappears throughout the history. In the Canadian tradition, I'm thinking primarily of the novels of Drouet, Marnier, François Réal, Angers, whose works re-examine the Canadian mythology of the missionary and the trapper and the conquest of the territoire au-delà, the upper territories. And in the U.S. tradition, we're all familiar with Cooper's use of the captivity motif in his Leatherstocking novels, and Melville's treatment of captivity among the Marquesans in Taipei. An even more interesting example is to be found in Melville. If we consider his Benito Sereno as an adaptation of the conventional captivity narrative. In this text, if you recall, the good New Englander comes upon a Spanish ship's captain who has been captured by a group of Africans. But the New Englander does not recognize that as captivity. He thinks the Africans are too passive a people. They've got the houseboy mentality built into their characters. And he simply refuses to recognize this as bona fide captivity. One of the many ironies of this text is that the Africans had actually been captives. They were enslaved peoples, and they were en route to North America to be sold on the slave market. But, of course, the New Englander would not have recognized that aspect as captivity, because for him, captivity of the African was the normal condition of these people. He wouldn't have framed that as a captivity narrative. Many women authors of the 19th century re-examine the mythology of the national history. And in doing so, they alter the motifs of the captivity narrative. And I'll give you one example. Catherine Sedgwick's novel, Hope Leslie, written in the 1820s, presents us with a reverse captivity. A young Indian woman, Magawiska, is taken captive by John Winthrop's family in Boston. Sedgwick asks us to lament that captivity, and we're asked to celebrate her release or her redemption back to her people. And within the same novel, Sedgwick includes yet another subplot where a Puritan woman has been captured by Magawiska's tribe. She marries Magawiska's brother, is recaptured or redeemed by her people, but she refuses her redemption, and she insists upon return to her people, the Narragansetts. At times within U.S. history, the captivity narrative as a literary genre has been used for direct political purpose. let me give you an example of this. And I'll use, yes?
I'm sorry.
No.
Could Cedric's novel be kind of a could it be considered as like an opening door to the noble savage attitude in North America?
Sure. She was relying on the work of Cooper at the time. And I don't want to say she's entirely derivative of Cooper, but their novels were so similar in motifs and in prose style that whenever Sedgwick wrote anonymously, people assumed it was Cooper writing. She does borrow on Cooper's characterization of Uncas, say, as the noble savage. But she turns the tables on that as well. She wants to make us understand that not only are the British Americans capable of murderous acts, but that the Native Americans are as well. She presents a fierce world. I don't know whether you would call that nobility, or she's trying to make us understand that independent of what Cooper puts forth, we're all capable of great evil. I was beginning to outline what I think is a fascinating publication history of Mary Rowlandson's narrative. It was a popular text when it was first published. It came out in 1682. 4 editions within the year, all sold out. One of our first bestsellers. However, that celebrity was short-lived because it almost immediately dropped from publication. With only 1 new edition published almost 40 years later. But interestingly, yet another 50 years passes, so 90 years past the point of initial publication, and there's renewed interest in Mary Rowlandson. 3 editions came out in 1770. In 1771, yet another edition. 3 new editions the next year. 2 editions in 1773. Why this affinity to Mary Rowlandson? Why this popularity? Why the interest in Indian captivity? And why at this time? Before I attempt to answer these questions, let me point to another piece of physical evidence, and that is the frontispiece of Mary Rowlandson's 1773 edition. And I don't know how well you, it actually comes through fairly nicely. I'm pleased. This woodcut strikes me as peculiar because it doesn't accurately represent the text as I know it. First, it depicts Mary Rowlandson defending her home with a rifle. She didn't have a rifle, and she was relatively passive during the attack, which was probably a sane posture. And second, the Native Americans are not depicted as Mary Rowlandson portrayed them. But here, they're wearing tidy British wigs, covered with British-styled hats, some of them, even coats with tails, breeches, and stockings. In short, they're stylized to resemble British soldiers. And we wouldn't recognize them as Native Americans except for the fact that we've got a few hatchets there that tell the tale on them. What's happening? What can we conclude from this evidence? The publication history and then the frontispiece of the 1773 edition. We can conclude that the captivity narrative of Mary Rowlandson was revived in the years immediately prior to the Revolutionary War in order to revive American interest in tales, generic tales of our people under siege from the enemy. Only the enemy has changed. So, as we see in the frontispiece, the identity of the Native Americans has been conflated with, or rather transferred to, the British soldier in order to identify him as the savage who's challenging our society and our rightful claim to this land. And in this way, the reissue of this captivity narrative served to galvanize support for colonial independence. In addition, it provided a narrative framework for new captivity narratives. This time, stories of colonial soldiers taken captive by British, and the most famous of which is Ethan Allen's account, which takes on the structure and many of the motifs of the earlier tales of Indian captivity. Finally, I'd like to suggest that the topos of captivity and this narrative formula provided a framework for the genre that we now call the slave narrative. The elements of captivity, the deprivation of captivity, the release from captivity are mirrored in the plot of the slave narrative, as are the religious invocations and the implications of the release. If you recall, Frederick Douglass, for one, expresses his freedom in terms of spiritual salvation, just as Mary Rowlandson did almost 200 years earlier. Of course, the slave narrative is much more sophisticated than the colonial captivity narrative in its literary form, in its psychological depth, and so on. However, in its earliest days, the slave account was modeled after accounts of captivity among the savages. And let's look again to the material text for evidence. And I'd like to compare the title pages of two such narratives, both published in 1670. I'm going to keep switching back and forth, and I hope it isn't confusing. What we have here is a narrative authored by Thomas Brown, identified on the title page as a man from Charlestown in New England. And the other one is authored by a slave, Britton Hammond, identified as a Negro man, servant to General Winslow of Marshfield, New England. And although these narratives were published by two different printing offices, both in the same year, of course, which is 1760, they're virtually identical. Let's look again. In the spatial arrangement of the text, the typeface, and even the little curly-cues, squiggly-doos at the top, virtually indistinguishable, as is the language. The plot of Thomas Brown's captivity narrative is rendered pretty succinctly. He returned to his father's house the beginning of January 1760 after having been absent for 3 years and about 8 months. Britton Hammond, Negro man, who returned to Boston after having been absent almost 13 years. I'll switch again. The account of a brief plot summary of Thomas Brown's, how he was taken captive by the Indians and carried to Canada, and from thence to the Mississippi, where he lived about a year and was again sent to Canada, during all which time he was not only in constant peril of his own life, but had the mortification of being an eyewitness of divers tortures and shocking cruelties that were practiced by the Indians on several English prisoners, one of whom he saw burnt to death, another tied to a tree, and his entrails drawn out, etc., etc. Britton Hammond, an account of the many hardships he underwent from the time he left his master's house in the year 1747 to the time of his return to Boston, how he was cast away in the Capes of Florida, the horrid cruelty and inhuman barbarity of the Indians in murdering the whole ship's crew, the manner of his being carried by them into captivity, also an account of his being confined 4 years and 7 months in a close dungeon, and the remarkable manner in which he met with his good master in London, who returned to New England a passenger in the same ship. Virtually identical accounts. Now, we must find real interest in that Britton Hammond's narrative, which is identified as one of our earliest slave narratives, is actually more closely aligned to the classic captivity narrative than it is to any statement of slavery and freedom that we've come to recognize as the classically authored slave narrative. The reader is never given to believe that Britton Hammond is a captive to his master, General Winslow, but that his captivity commences when he is taken by those barbarous Indians in the Caribbean. And in fact, Hammond's great failing, his sin, is leaving his master's house. And his great fortune is being returned to his slavery under Winslow, his good master. If time permitted, we could investigate the plot and the language of the actual narrative and see much additional evidence in this text that one of our earliest slave narratives is closely patterned after the classic classic captivity narrative. So, the genre of the slave narrative clearly developed further. It separated itself from the captivity narrative, but into the late 19th century, the slave narrative exhibits the motifs and the forms of its origin in the tales of captivity. So I will return you to Professor Mintz now, and I hope that this brief investigation of captivity narratives gives you a fuller understanding of the varied experience of colonial English and French, as well as the contexts and pretexts of their narratives. We have one more question. Yes?
I'm sorry, I didn't really catch your name at the beginning of your lecture. Can you please repeat your name?
Baker, Dorothy Baker. Thank you.
As of today, the best-selling film in Hollywood history is Independence Day. It has sold $446 million worth of tickets. And that places it just ahead in real terms of the second leading film in history, which was E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Now, I find this quite interesting because both films, in essence, deal with exactly the same subject. They deal with the encounter between us and them. Obviously, in one film, the encounter is negative, and in the other, the encounter is positive. In short, in both films, the encounter is extremely formulaic. What we've done today in our class is talk about real encounters between various us's and them's, between groups, people who never imagined the other's existence, but who, through twists of fate, did encounter each other. And I hope what we have seen is that the story of those encounters is much more complex and, I think, a lot more interesting than anything that Hollywood was ever able to imagine. It's a story of death, disease, destruction. It's a story of conflict, but it's also a story of accommodation. It's a story of co-optation and adaptation. In other words, it's a tremendously complex story that we put under the name conquest, but it's a lot more complicated than that word ever implies. What I'm going to do today is to end by telling you 3 stories, if I have time, which I think underscore the complexities of conquest and also help us to better understand the psychology of conquest. And the first story I'm going to tell you is one that you're all familiar with. If we could have the overhead, please. This is the story of Pocahontas, another successful Hollywood film. Now, most of the history that we know, we get from childhood tales, from folklore, from myth, and especially from movies. And no company has successfully made more money by exploiting the country's interest in its past than Walt Disney. Whether it's Davy Crockett coonskin hats, or it's the robot of Abraham Lincoln that you can see at Disneyland reciting the Gettysburg Address, Disney realizes that while people hate history courses, they love history. They're even willing to pay for it. But that interest in history, the Disney version of history, or what I might call Mickey Mouse history, comes at a price. It distorts real history. And so what I want to do next is talk about the real story of Pocahontas and how it's different from the legend that we're all familiar with. No one ever expects a movie to be a school book, and you would walk out if a movie ever turned into a lecture. Nevertheless, I think the movie Pocahontas, or the story you learned as a youth, tells us a great deal about the psychological mechanisms that Americans use to evade the real meaning of our history. In real life, Pocahontas was 12 years old when the English arrived in Virginia. She was not yet a Barbie doll. She was the daughter of Powhatan, who was the leader. He's sometimes called a chief, but this is a quite misleading term to apply to him. He was the leader of a large Indian confederacy, a confederacy that crossed most of Virginia and included about 20,000 people. So this is not the chief of a small tribe. This is a major political and military leader. Now, the story of Pocahontas, which is here in our overhead, illustrated in the book of Captain John Smith, his General History of Virginia. John Smith had been taken captive by Powhatan. Powhatan ordered his braves to slay John Smith with a hatchet, but Pocahontas put her head over John Smith's neck and saved him from being killed. We all know that story. So Pocahontas in the Disney version becomes a symbol of interracial harmony, a symbol of peace, who brings people together. And now let's see if we could look deeper and understand what's really going on. One mechanism that people use to evade the real meaning of the past is called a screen memory. A screen memory. S-C-R-E-E-N, memory. It's something that Sigmund Freud talks about in psychoanalysis. And when I describe it to you, you'll all be familiar with what it is. What it simply means is it's a recollection of childhood that is demonstrably false, but which people believe nonetheless, because it plays a very important role in their psychology. Nations, like individuals, have screen memories. That is, Americans don't remember anything about whites' relations with Indians, except one thing, the story of Pocahontas. So Pocahontas, I would argue, is a screen memory. Now, the true story of English colonization of Virginia is a nauseating story of racial warfare and conflict. It's a story that would be replayed many times in the New World, a struggle over land, of resources, and cultural dominance. So it's quite different than the Disney version of the story. So what's really going on, if we could look again at our picture, in this episode that probably took place? Most historians would probably say that this episode took place. Pocahontas didn't really rescue John Smith. This was a staged event. It was a ritual. What it was an elaborate adoption ceremony. John Smith's threatened, Powhatan saves his life, and John Smith is to become his servant, a vassal, a servant of Powhatan. Now, unfortunately, Captain John Smith didn't understand this at all. He didn't know that this was a common practice among the Powhatan Indians. He assumed that there was something special about the way he was treated, and he didn't understand that he was being turned into a subordinate. Now, what the Powhatan Indians try to do is incorporate their enemies into their society. But that's not the English view. The English view is to dispossess people of their land. So John Smith doesn't understand at all what's going on. There's two different stories here, but only one makes the Disney version. Now, the film Pocahontas ends after, it doesn't go into this, but John Smith shot himself in the groin. He thought he was going to die. They sent him back to England. But that's, of course, not the end of the real story. When Pocahontas was 18, she was abducted by the English in Virginia. And she was placed on a boat for about 2 years. This is a captivity narrative, but a little different one than the ones we're familiar with. Now, Pocahontas expected her father, Powhatan, to negotiate for her rescue. But he didn't. We don't know exactly why or whether the negotiations fell through, but he didn't. And so she's left on this boat for 2 years. And while she's there, she marries an Englishman. Again, it looks like a kind of forced marriage, whose name was John Rolfe, R-O-L-F-E. Now, John Rolfe is a very important figure in American history, U.S. history. That is, he is the man who takes the Indian practice of growing tobacco and introduces it among the whites. So he is the first tobacco planter. Now, growing tobacco required two things. It required land and it required labor. And John Rolfe believed he knew where to get that land and where to get that labor. It was from the Powhatan Indians. And in May 1622, Pocahontas' brother led the largest Native American attack on whites in early North American history. About a third of the English were killed in Virginia as a result of this 1622 attack, including John Rolfe. Now, another psychological mechanism that I would argue we often use to protect ourselves against the real meaning of the past, I'll call depersonalization. And what I mean by depersonalization is we treat victims as victims. We assume that people are often passive and lack human agency, and that is why they lose out. Historically, that is a common way of dealing with victims. If they lost out, it's because they couldn't do anything at all. But it's interesting if you look at the history of early Virginia. If you look at early Virginia, Native Americans were clearly active agents, and it was the Virginians, the English, who were on the verge of extermination. after 12 years of settlement in Virginia, 3,600 Englishmen had arrived. Of those, 3,000 were dead, mainly as the result of disease, though somewhat of warfare as well. But eventually the English would prosper there, and it's clear in retrospect that a critical figure in this was Pocahontas. Now, Pocahontas is often called the Indian princess, and she would later be taken to visit the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth, as an Indian princess. But she wasn't really a princess. She was the daughter of a king of Powhatan, but she was not actually in the line of succession. So she wasn't like Di. She was more like Fergie, I guess. Okay. And apparently Pocahontas really did understand this and was able to kind of chart out her own best self-interest. She would play a critical role as a cultural intermediary, as a cultural communicator who would play a critical role in forging alliances, transferring knowledge, facilitating communication. She played a critical role in helping the English adapt to a new situation. Now, it's very difficult to know how to understand her. Is she a pawn? Is she a traitor? Or is she simply a confused individual who's trying to do her very best in an exceedingly complex situation? Let me leave the Pocahontas story with one last meaning. And that's what I would call the romance of colonization. The romance of colonization. Now, the story of Pocahontas is, of course, of a white explorer saved by a dark-skinned princess. And it turns out that these stories are extremely common in European history. It's not just this, but I could find other examples from the Middle East, from Africa, from the Far East, where these same stories are told. What you have is the fantasy of European colonization. That is, the contest between Europe and third world peoples is translated, it's personalized into a love affair between a handsome Mel Gibson sounding European and a sexy, dark, feminine princess. In fact, the real John Smith was an old man, well into his 40s. He was scraggly, not very handsome at all. Okay, I'm going to tell you another story that again illustrates the complexities of colonization before we let you go. And this is the story of the Virgin of Guadalupe, the Virgin of Guadalupe. And some of you have probably seen her picture because the Virgin of Guadalupe is the patron saint of Mexico. She is the single most important symbol of Mexican identity. But like many symbols, it is extremely complicated. Now, there is a shrine to the Virgin of Guadalupe just north of Mexico City, and each year, hundreds of thousands of people go to visit this shrine. Now, the story of its origins is an interesting one. In 1531, the Virgin Mary appeared before a humble Indian named Juan Diego. And the Virgin spoke to Juan Diego in the native Indian language Nahuatl. The Virgin ordered Juan Diego to tell the Archbishop of Mexico that a church needed to be built on this site. But of course, an Indian could not go speak to the Archbishop. So the Virgin Mary told him what to do. He should go to an area where only cactuses grew, and there he would find some roses, and he would put the roses underneath his cloak, And then when he came near the archbishop, he was to open up his cloak. And he did, and the roses had turned into the image of the Virgin Mary. So now the archbishop knows he has to listen to the Indian who tells him to build the shrine at this one location. Now this is an interesting story because it's very complex symbolically. The shrine, the church, would be built on a place where the Mexica, the Aztec, had had a shrine to their goddess of fertility. So this is not just located anywhere, it's located on a traditional Indian shrine. Okay. Now, the Virgin Mary is, if we could have the picture again, is a symbol of fertility, just like the Mexica goddess. And notice that she's dark-skinned. She's Indian here. What we're seeing, in short, is a mixture, what I would call a syncretism or hybridization of folk religion and Catholicism. We're seeing them blend together here. Now, the Virgin of Guadalupe also illustrates some other themes that I want to talk about. There was a debate in the 1500s among Spanish churchmen about whether Indians were human. And the Virgin of Guadalupe was used as the most powerful symbol by those who argued that the Indians were human, that they were capable of being converted to Christianity and would worship. Okay, so this is being used as a strategic instrument. To rural Mexicans, the Virgin was viewed as a protectress. She was absorbed into traditional Indian agricultural rites. She was also viewed as an intermediary. That is, many Indians who believed that Jesus or God were too remote could pray to the Virgin who would communicate for them. And of course, the Virgin also transcends class and racial divisions. By worshiping the Virgin of Guadalupe, you were able to bring together, to cut across Indian Spanish lines and develop a new symbol that can be shared by each. And this symbol would be used many times. There were a series of terrible floods in Mexico in 1629, and so there were appeals by both the Spanish and the Indians to the Virgin of Guadalupe to rescue the nation. Then in the 18th century, the Virgin of Guadalupe would become Mexico's patron saint. And then in the early 19th century, a Spanish priest, Miguel Hidalgo, would use the Virgin of Guadalupe as his symbol, as his banner in struggling against Spanish rule. And so the Virgin of Guadalupe would become the key symbol in Mexico's battle for independence from European rule. So, you can again see how complex these symbols and images are. Okay, I'm going to tell you one other story very, very briefly. And it's the story of a man named Pope, P-O-P-E, in New Mexico. During the 1600s, Spain, quote-unquote, conquered New Mexico. And once in New Mexico, the Spanish tried to impose Catholicism on the Pueblo Indians who inhabited the region. Now, the Pueblo were happy to be converted so long as they could also practice their traditional religious rites. They just viewed the new Christian deities as simply supplements to what they already had. Okay? But the priests were not very happy with this, and they began to desecrate the kivas, the religious shrines of the Indians, with human excrement. And then they began to execute the Indian priests. Now the Indians, the Pueblo Indians, were very unhappy with this, and in 1680 they rose up and they expelled the Spanish from New Mexico. Approximately a third of all the Spanish in New Mexico were killed, and the remainder were exiled back into Mexico proper. And then the problems emerged. The Pueblo Indians were not the only Indians who lived in New Mexico. There were also other Indian groups, particularly the Navajo and the Apaches, who were also eager to control New Mexico. And the Navajo and the Apache were much more powerful. And so finally, in 1690, the Pueblo invited the Spanish back to New Mexico, and they arranged a cultural compromise. And the compromise was this: Spain would provide protection, and nominally the Indians would be Catholic. But in exchange, the Spanish would tolerate the practice of traditional Indian religion. Conquest had taken place by invitation only. And the result was not the imposition of European culture, but a strange hybrid mixture. That's enough for today.